The wind screamed through the streets like a wild animal. Maya pressed her thin coat closer to her body, but it did nothing against the bitter cold. Snow fell so thick she could barely see 3 feet ahead. Her fingers had gone numb an hour ago, and her legs felt like they might give out at any moment. She worked double shifts at the diner 6 days a week, and today had been particularly brutal. Her tips barely covered the bus fare home, but the buses had stopped running. She had no choice but to walk. That's when she saw her. An old woman sat hunched against a brick wall, her frail body shaking violently. She wore nothing but a tattered cardigan and a thin dress. Her lips had turned blue, and her eyes stared blankly at the ground. Maya's heart lurched. She knew that look. It was the look of someone who had given up, someone waiting for the cold to take them. Maya didn't have much. Her apartment was barely bigger than a closet, her bank account held $17, and she hadn't eaten a proper meal in 3 days. But she couldn't walk past this woman. She couldn't pretend she hadn't seen her. Maya knelt down, her knees sinking into the snow. The old woman's eyes slowly lifted to meet hers. They were cloudy with age but still held a flicker of awareness. You can't stay here. You'll freeze to death. Maya's voice trembled, not just from the cold but from the weight of what she was about to do. The old woman didn't respond, just stared. Maya made her decision. She wrapped her arm around the woman's shoulders and helped her to her feet. The woman was lighter than she expected, fragile as a bird. Together, they began the slow, painful journey to Maya's apartment, fighting against the storm with every step. Maya's apartment was a disaster. The heater barely worked, the walls were stained with mold, and the single window was cracked. But it was shelter, and right now, that was everything. She guided the old woman to the only chair she owned and wrapped her in every blanket she could find. The woman's shaking began to slow, but she still hadn't spoken a word. Maya filled a pot with water and set it on the stove to boil. She had 1 packet of instant noodles left, her planned meal for tomorrow. Without hesitation, she tore it open and prepared it. The old woman watched her with those cloudy eyes, and Maya wondered what she was thinking, what had brought her to that frozen street corner. When the noodles were ready, Maya brought the bowl to her. The woman's hands shook as she lifted the spoon to her lips, but she ate slowly, deliberately, as if each bite was precious. "What's your name?" Maya asked softly. The woman looked at her for a long moment before answering. Her voice was barely a whisper, rough from disuse. "Catherine." The name hung in the air between them. Catherine. A simple name, yet it carried weight, a lifetime of stories Maya would never fully know. They sat in silence as the storm raged outside. Maya turned on the small space heater she rarely used because of the electric bill. Tonight, that didn't matter. She made tea from an old box she'd found in the back of her cupboard, and they shared it. As the night wore on, Catherine began to speak. Her words came in fragments at first, then in longer streams. She talked about her son, about how she'd lost track of him years ago after a terrible argument. She spoke of regret, of wishing she could see him one more time. Maya listened without judgment, her heart aching for this woman who had been forgotten by the world. When Catherine finally fell asleep, Maya sat awake watching her, praying she'd made the right choice. Dawn broke cold and gray. Maya woke from her uncomfortable position on the floor, her back screaming in protest. Catherine was still asleep in the chair, breathing steadily. Relief flooded through Maya. The old woman had survived the night. Maya stood quietly, careful not to wake her, and looked out the cracked window. The storm had passed, leaving behind a world buried in white. The streets were empty, silent. Maya had to go to work. She couldn't afford to miss a shift, not when she was already behind on rent. But she couldn't leave Catherine alone either. She left a note on the small table explaining where she'd gone and promising to return with food. She placed her house key next to the note, a gesture of trust that probably wasn't wise but felt necessary. As she pulled on her coat and stepped into the frozen morning, doubt gnawed at her. What if something happened? What if Catherine needed help? The diner was chaos. Everyone who'd been snowed in yesterday wanted breakfast, and Maya moved through the rush on autopilot. Her manager yelled at her for being distracted, but she couldn't focus. Her mind kept drifting back to the apartment, to Catherine sitting alone in that chair. During her break, she used the last of her money to buy 2 sandwiches from the diner's kitchen. One for Catherine, one for herself. When her shift finally ended, Maya practically ran home. Her heart pounded as she climbed the stairs to her apartment. The door was still locked, exactly as she'd left it. She pushed it open and froze. Catherine wasn't alone. A man stood in the center of the tiny room, tall and imposing in an expensive coat. His face was hard, angular, his eyes scanning the apartment with barely concealed disgust. When those eyes landed on Maya, they held something between suspicion and anger. "Who are you?" The man's voice cut through the room like a blade. Maya's hand tightened on the doorknob. Catherine sat in the chair, looking smaller than ever, her expression unreadable. Maya's first instinct was fear. This stranger had somehow gotten into her apartment. But then she noticed the way Catherine was looking at him, a mixture of hope and sorrow that made Maya's chest tight. "I live here," Maya said, forcing her voice to stay steady. "Who are you?" "My name is Richard Montgomery." He said it like she should recognize the name, like it carried weight. Maya stared at him blankly. "This is my mother," he continued, gesturing to Catherine. "And I'd like to know why she's in your apartment." Understanding dawned. This was Catherine's son, the one she'd spoken about with such longing. But there was no warmth in his voice, no relief that his mother was safe. Only accusation. Maya felt anger spark in her chest. She was freezing to death on the street last night during the storm. "I brought her here because I couldn't leave her." Maya moved further into the room, placing the bag with the sandwiches on the table. "I gave her what little I had." Richard's eyes swept over the apartment again, taking in the peeling paint, the broken heater, the blankets piled on the floor where Maya had slept. His jaw tightened. "How much do you want?" The question hit Maya like a slap. "Excuse me? How much money do you want? For taking care of her?" His hand moved toward his jacket, reaching for what Maya assumed was a wallet. "Name your price." Catherine made a small sound, something between a gasp and a sob. Maya felt rage boiling inside her, hot and fierce. This man thought she'd saved his mother for money? That kindness had a price tag? She stepped forward, her small frame suddenly feeling powerful. "I don't want your money. I helped your mother because it was the right thing to do, because she's a human being who needed help. Maybe that's a concept you can't understand in your expensive coat." Richard's face flushed red. For a moment, Maya thought he might yell, might unleash the anger she could see building behind his eyes. Instead, he deflated. His shoulders sagged, and he turned to look at his mother. When he spoke again, his voice was completely different, broken and raw. "I've been searching for her for 3 days." He sank onto the edge of Maya's makeshift bed, his head in his hands. "She has dementia. She wandered away from her care facility during the storm. I had the police looking, private investigators, everyone. I thought she was dead." The anger drained from Maya's body. She looked at Catherine, who was watching her son with tears streaming down her weathered face. The old woman reached out a trembling hand toward him. "Richard," Catherine whispered. "My boy." Richard moved to his mother, kneeling beside her chair and taking her fragile hand in both of his. "I'm here, Mom. I'm here." He looked up at Maya, and his eyes were red. "I'm sorry. I was terrified. When I tracked her phone here, to this neighborhood, I assumed the worst. I thought someone was taking advantage of her." Maya understood then. His anger hadn't been about cruelty but about fear, about a son who'd nearly lost his mother. She nodded slowly. "She's safe. That's what matters." What happened next changed everything. Richard insisted on repaying Maya, not as an insult but as genuine gratitude. He paid her rent for a year. He offered her a job at his company with a real salary, benefits, and opportunities for growth. Maya cried when she accepted, overwhelmed by the sudden shift in her circumstances. But more than the money or the job, it was Catherine's words that stayed with her. Before they left, Catherine gripped Maya's hand with surprising strength. "You saved me," she said, her cloudy eyes suddenly clear. "Not just from the storm. You reminded me that good people still exist." As Maya watched them drive away in Richard's expensive car, she thought about how one choice, one moment of compassion on the coldest night, had transformed 2 lives. Hers and theirs. The storm had passed, but its impact would last forever.